Good afternoon, everyone. We'll give it another minute for people to phone in and log in, and then we will soon begin the webinar. So in about a minute. Okay, good day, everyone. Welcome to this webinar of the NASEO-NARUC GRID Interactive Efficient Buildings Working Group. We are pleased today to bring you two speakers on this important subject. We will have Monica Newcomb of the Department of Energy provide a GEB overview, followed by Mary Ann Piet of Lawrence Berkeley National Lab speaking on GEB and automated demand response. Monica is a senior advisor at the U.S. DOE Building Technologies Office. She currently leads the GEB portfolio there, including developing strategies for new directions at the Buildings Technology Office and managing analytic projects to help establish a framework for GEB potential and measurement. Prior to this, Monica had worked in a number of roles at DOE, focusing on energy efficiency and public-private partnerships, including developing the Better Buildings program. She notes that she is a proud Oregon duck, and maybe we will talk about duck curves, and has a bachelor's from the University of Oregon, as well as a master in public policy from University of Maryland. She'll be followed by Mary Ann Piet of the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. She is a senior scientist and director of the Building Technology and Urban Systems Division there. She oversees LBNL's building energy research activities with DOE, that was another subject, DA, with the Department of Energy and 25 other R&D sponsors. She also directs the Demand Response Research Center that has been developing DR technologies for over 15 years, and you'll hear about some of that later. She has a master's in mechanical engineering from UC Berkeley, and I'm not sure if I'll pronounce this right, and a licentiate in building services and engineering from Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden. Before going to their presentations, I do want to say, next slide please, a few words about webinar logistics, and then I want to spend a few minutes on the NASEO-NARUC Working Group. There's some announcements on that I'd like to go over. Regarding logistics, all attendees are muted. We will have a Q&A session after the presentations. Please use the question box that is on the right side of your GoToWebinar screen and enter the questions through that. The webinar is being recorded and the slides will be posted. Those will be accessible through the NASEO homepage. There's a tab called Events, and then under that, a way to link to past webinars. Thanks. And next again. So I would like to spend a few minutes on the working group. NASEO is very pleased to work with NARUC and collaborate with NARUC on this effort. And actually, our colleague Danielle Sass-Burnett is on the call too. This working group has been developed in the face of the advancing technologies that are opening up opportunities for flexible building and facility load management. You'll hear quite a bit about that today and in future webinars and events. The opportunities, of course, are to reduce costs, enhance resilience, reduce emissions through reducing peak demand, moderating ramp rates, and providing grid services. Values can accrue to both at the generation level, distribution level, and through provision of ancillary services. We won't get too much into that today, but those could be topics for further exploration in future webinars and events. At base, the questions are, how can we optimize facility interactions with the grid? And how can states fashion policies, programs, and regulations to advance such optimization? So the purpose of the working group, which we are thankful for Department of Energy's support, is to inform states about GEB technologies and applications, and to identify opportunities and impediments. These can be technical issues, and they could be non-technical policy, regulatory, or programmatic issues. And then to also help identify and express the state's various priorities, concerns, and interests, and then reinforce recognition of temporal and locational value of energy efficiency, as well as other demand distributed energy resources. And then, of course, to enhance energy system reliability, resilience, and affordability. In short, how can we help inform states in their planning, policy, regulations, and programs, and also to help advance potential roadmaps and pilots. Next. Oh, that is next. So the activities of the working group will be of several types. This is an early sort of first of a series of webinars. The webinars will be available to all states. We also plan a number of briefing papers, which will include non-technical as well as technical consideration. And then for the working group itself, we will have more deeper engagement, including state-specific calls, topical calls and exchanges with the working group states, and a planned workshop for the fall that will likely piggyback on NASEO's annual meeting. We also will be working with the states to scope potential road mapping kit. This isn't actually doing the road mapping, but to help states explore GEB in their own state's context, and to scope potential state pilots, including informing development of pilots to explore priority issues in the state. We're also working with the Department of Energy to explore the opportunity for national laboratory technical assistance for the working group states, which can help scope potential pilots and roadmaps and outline the elements, questions, and considerations for those activities. Next, please. So really, I'd like to take a time to recognize Casey Radcliffe of the Oregon Department of Energy and Hannah Terwilliger of the Minnesota PUC staff. They have kindly stepped up to co-chair this GEB working group. We're very pleased to have them. And we're also very pleased to announce 13 states, a lucky 13, listed there. I won't read them all, that will be participating in this activity for over the next year. Where our plan is, in the short term, is to reach out to each of these working group states to better learn its interests and context, and to solicit topics for deeper exploration as we develop additional webinars, calls, and other opportunities. Next, please. So that's mostly what I have to say. We do have a list of resources, but that will be available in the posted presentations afterwards. And we do invite questions and inquiries. My NASEO colleague Stephen Goss and I, and Danielle Sass-Burnett, our partner at NARUC, is also available for the NARUC community. And we're very pleased to have you on this. Let's go ahead and go to Monica. Monica,
Great.
You're up to bat. Yep.
All righty, great. Well, thanks, Rod and Danielle, for having me join this conversation today. So I'm going to just spend a few minutes giving a brief update of our work at BTO around grid interactive efficient buildings, our research there. And then I'll spend a few minutes talking about some specific projects that might be relevant as well. So if you want to turn to the next page, I always like to sort of start with a why. And Rod, thanks for already outlining some of the key reasons why we're doing this work. You know, we have both from the utility and building owner perspective, reasons why we've sort of moved in this direction. From the grid perspective, there's increased need for resiliency, peak demand needs, increase of renewables on the system. And for building owners, you know, there's an increased interest in looking at different storage options, understanding how to integrate renewables to meet sustainability goals, and really trying to understand how the role of the building in integrating all of these technologies together. So at BTO, we've started looking at our existing building technology work and how those same technologies can really help to sort of flex energy consumption around the amount and the time of use. And you know, how this can benefit both the owner and occupant and the grid. So we call that our grid interactive efficient building work. And this picture just represents sort of some of those different pieces. You can see distributed energy resources and the little Wi-Fi signals indicating that they are connected. But really, what I'd like to pull your attention to is sort of this call out here of inputs for optimization. So a grid interactive efficient building really does require some form of an energy management system that is able to take in a number of inputs to optimize the building operations in an integrated way. Both, of course, the number one thing is comfort for the occupant, but then also to provide grid services for new value stream. And if we move to the next slide, I can get into a little bit more detail, sort of the key characteristics that really revolve around the controls. But first, I'll start with that. As we talked about, again, we always think about energy efficiency. So many of the things that we've always focused on at BTO: high quality walls and windows, high performance appliances, equipment, and optimized building demands that will help to reduce both net energy consumption and peak demand. And then, as I mentioned before, really the need for some form of energy management system that's connected. In some situations, you might just need connection to receive a signal, and in some situations, you may need to be able to respond to a third-party entity indicating, you know, communication about the service that is being provided. And then, additionally, the buildings are smart. They have analytics supported by sensors and controls that allow for this optimization in an integrated and optimized way. And finally, as a result of all this, you have a flexible building where energy loads can be shaped or optimized across behind-the-meter generation, EV, and energy storage. So moving to the next slide, so I've sort of just described some of the key characteristics of a GEB, a building that can provide that. And we then think about these buildings as being able to provide demand flexibility. And this slide just sort of lays out those different modes of flexibility. So first, of course, is the efficiency, which I discussed. So bringing down the level of energy use overall. And then at any given level of energy efficiency in a given baseline load, the building can provide these other flexibility modes depending on what's needed. You can either shed your load, reducing the amount of load that's required. You can shift it, so moving it to a different time of the day, taking advantage of the cheapest electricity price or helping to reduce peak periods. And then you can also modulate, so these are the faster sort of services that provide the ability to balance power supply or demand or reactive power supply. And that would be more at like the sub-second to second time frame. And then we don't have a specific little call out here for generate, but of course, if you have some form of typically renewables, you're able to generate electricity for on-site consumption and even dispatch that if you have some sort of storage like batteries to help out. So then if you bring those all together, this is sort of the net load here, the last image of the efficiency plus generate and shift and shed load. You're sort of looking at that teal line to help with a flatter overall energy load. So shifting over, to this slide. So this is just, I know there's a lot to look at here, and we actually have a report that I should be able to send out to y'all after this that goes through and summarizes what a GEB is and demand flexibility. It calls out, of course, the grid services that Rod mentioned, but really importantly also looks at, from the building owner's perspective. So great, they're able to provide the grid service, but what does that actually mean to the building and the impact on the occupants? So we've created sort of some of the requirements that a building would have to follow in order to provide a specific grid service, and then, to help think through what that actually means for the building. So this is just a snapshot of looking at different grid services and what, that means. So if you want to, if you look at shed load, for instance, if you wanted to provide a contingency reserve, you'd have to reduce your load within a certain time frame, and you probably have to sustain that. You may have to sustain that up to 1 hour. So just important things for a building owner to be aware of if they're going to want to participate in providing a grid service. All right, then moving to the next slide, of course, really important, understanding the benefits of demand flexibility. And we actually are working with LBNL right now on a report that helps summarize the benefits and think through the evaluation of demand flexibility, something that we'd be happy, I think, take an entire hour, probably webinar to walk through and answer questions on. This is just a quick snapshot looking from the utility perspective, a number of benefits from reduced generation costs to on the distribution line, and then also from ancillary services as well. And then from the customer perspective, the ability to reduce utility bills, increase satisfaction. Because of the controls that you now have, you're able to optimize for occupant needs, and then increase flexibility as well. And then more broadly, there's also some society benefits from resiliency and environmental benefits as well. So we move to the next slide. Yeah, so that was just a quick summary of the work that we have focused right now on our grid interactive efficient buildings work. The next two slides will just focus on how we're organizing our work in this space. So we have 4 sort of key buckets right now that we have focused our work. The first bucket is around valuation, so really better understanding the value to stakeholders, including groups like yourself, and thinking more about the national value of demand flexibility. We also are focused on technology, looking to better understand the end uses that provide the best solutions. So we have a series of reports out right now that are evaluating across all the different building technologies to understand which ones are best suited towards demand flexibility. Optimization is critically important, as I mentioned, the control aspect. So we're looking at optimizing within a building across a number of inputs, but then also thinking about how to optimize across a set of buildings. That could be a district, a microgrid, a campus. So that's a big chunk of our work. And then last, validation is something that we know is critically important, and it's something that we're looking to do more work in the future. As we talk to more utilities, business owners, et cetera, they're really looking for more sort of research in this space. And then I'll end on a slide that just runs through a few specific projects I thought you might find interesting. As I mentioned, we have a GEB technical report series where we have drafts of all these reports. We'll be looking to finalize them later in August, but really they lay out the opportunity across different building technologies. We also have a report series that is more geared towards stakeholders such as yourself, so state leaders and local leaders who, and those are sort of looking at it from a different angle. So there'll be an overview document just looking from a state and local leader perspective, but also valuation and assessing performance. We also have a number of stakeholder groups gathering feedback. So we have a utility working group with ACEEE, primarily focused on commercial efforts, but we'll also look at some residential. This working group, which we're really excited to be working with you and hearing your feedback through this process. And we're also working with some of our Better Buildings partners, understanding from their perspective, gathering feedback to feedback into our research. And then just noting that we have a number of research and validation projects going on from all the way down from metrics to standardization of technologies, et cetera, that will be moving forward in this work. So with that, I'll end it, and I look forward to our discussion after Marianne.
Thank you very much, Monica. And I do want to remind folks that the question box is available on the right side of your screen. And so please use that if you have any questions. Marianne, on to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to participate in today's webinar. I'm going to try to do this in about 20 minutes so that we can have some time for Q&A. I may go a few minutes over, but I've got my timer going here. I'm going to be talking about work that's funded by the California Energy Commission as well as NYSERDA and Bonneville Power. Very grateful of DOE's new activities in this area too. So very excited about the new national effort on this topic. Go ahead to the next slide. So talking about the need for, it's interesting to see what happened to some of our fonts, but the need for grid services, automation and technology, the demand response potential study, a quick look at some of our projects for DOE. I have one slide on Lisa Schwartz and Steve Schiller's Sea Action report, and then I have one final slide at the end. Go ahead to the next slide. So many of you know that the peak hot summer hours require the grid to be bigger. And so one of the historical reasons we do demand response is to reduce the need for a larger transmission and distribution system. So in California in the mid-2000s, that last 45 to 50 gigawatts was less than 1% of the hours. And that makes the system very expensive and potentially unreliable. And that's still an issue in many parts of the country, and there's local reliability challenges with the electric grid. One of the more recent phenomena is the duck curve, which you saw the duck-type shapes in what Monica showed, that we want to improve the affordability of electricity by reducing the number of hours that we're actually generating too much solar and take advantage of those things. Go ahead to the next slide. So it's useful to think about the objectives on the left, where we talk about the reliability of the grid, the economics of the grid, addressing local congestion, and improving the integration of intermittent renewable resources on the grid. So those are all reasons why we want these grid services. And when we think about the grid services, we need to be able to schedule and interact with buildings. I'm talking mostly about buildings, a little bit on industrial, but essentially we need to be able to send some sort of price or some sort of signal. There's been a big investment into the Zigbee smart meters, and that's used in some areas. A lot of work in OpenADR, which I'll talk about. And we're moving from a world where historically most of the demand response has been manual into automated. So it used to be you get a phone call and you'd be asked to initiate some sort of load response in the buildings. And now we're moving towards a more automated technology platform. There's a lot of ways to get automation signals to the facilities. So we want to think about centralized controls, installing gateways, embedding it directly in devices, dishwashers and washing machines and thermostats. So there's a lot of architecture around these systems that we need to understand. Go ahead to the next slide. So the purpose of OpenADR, which we started developing in 2002, was to develop a language of grid signals. And the language of signals has to do with the idea that there's an XML data model, and that's an open data model that we can use to understand and communicate to devices in the buildings. We use that technology with the internet, and so we're sending two-way signals to systems that are actually communicating directly with the building loads using what's called a client-server architecture. And the client-server architecture has servers that are at PG&E and SoCal Edison and SMUD, and they are sending two-way signals to the building all year round. The building is pre-programmed to do something when those signals change. So this technology is in use throughout California. It's been adopted by Bonneville Power, and it's being pilot tested in many states around the U.S. It's also widely used in Korea and Japan, and it is a data model for communicating grid signals. The information can be prices, it can be modes, and it's a technology that is available on the market through an open data communication protocol. Go ahead to the next slide. Back in 2003, we did the first automation test. Before we called it OpenADR, we called it AutoDR. We had an Albertsons, a Bank of America, a GSA Federal Building, Roche Pharmaceuticals, and UC Santa Barbara. And what we had done was we developed the XML signals to communicate with the control system. And you can see on the bottom, for the buildings, it did HVAC controls. We actually had an anti-sweat heater on the refrigeration cases and the lighting at the grocery store. And we used a common signaling system to send prices to the buildings. And we pre-programmed the buildings through gateways or relays to communicate to the controls. So this is fully automated, and nobody needed to be at the store. In fact, the Albertsons in Oakland was listening to a signal that was coming to it from Florida, from a signal that we sent from LBL. So these systems are distributed over the internet, and it's a way for us to get automation signals to the different buildings. Go ahead to the next slide. So these are what sheds look like. And on the top left, that's a 10 megawatt industrial compressed air automated shed. It's a very large site that had been on an interruptible program, but they participated in the automated demand response program and shed about 10 megawatts and kept it off all night. On the bottom right is about a 2 megawatt shed from about 20 commercial buildings. That was a 6-hour critical peak price event. It had 2 stages of prices. It had a mid-price and a high price. And then on the top right is a cold winter morning in Seattle. So I'll tell you a little about how we did this with the individual buildings, but we use that OpenADR technology. And we create baselines that are based on the previous 10 days. Sometimes those baselines are weather normalized. And we try to track how much watts per square foot, or kW, we can actually reduce at each of the buildings. Go ahead to the next one. So this slide shows you a list of buildings, and we've got IKEA and Target and Walmart and some office buildings. Most of the buildings, the strategy they used was to change the global temperature in the zones. So on the black came out kind of funny in the colors here, but the blue at the bottom is the temperature they were at. So many of them were running around 70 degrees, and they'd go up to about 78 or 76. Some of them were running at 76 all the time. And so all the state buildings at this time were running warmer. And so we're going from some temperature to some other temperature. And the picture here shows in the red line what the baseline was, and then the 2 3-hour periods or 6-hour critical peak price event. We didn't tell them what to do, but we facilitated the automation, and we studied the different HVAC strategies. So some of them limited the cooling valve, some of them limited the fan quantity. They decide what to do, and we helped automate it. You'll see several of them did lighting. And then on the very right is the column that says Other. And the Svenhart's Bakery here in Oakland, they bought extra pans, and they turned off the dishwasher. So they decide what to do, and we facilitate getting automation, and we allow them to create some kind of electric load shape. And we, in general, can get about 0.5 to 1 watt a square foot. Average office building in the U.S. uses about 6 watts a square foot, so we can actually reduce the electricity by initiating these strategies. And we study a lot about comfort. I'll talk about that in the next slide. Go ahead to the next one. So there's been a lot of research on the use of mass, and that is what most of the buildings did. Now, U.S. buildings are known to be too cold in the summer and too warm in the winter. So we'll talk about the link between energy efficiency and demand response in a moment. But in a lot of work that we've done, we were actually surveying people about when we did these temperature adjustments. Maybe we did some pre-cooling in the morning and let the temperature rise up in the afternoon to get some sort of change in the electric loads. And in many cases, people are actually more comfortable because the building was overcooled to begin with. So there's a little bit of an issue on how well the building is actually commissioned. And the Santa Rosa building in California, we got about 2 watts a square foot. So, you know, this is a little bit on, if the building has a lot of glass, it's not going to be a good candidate for this, but if it has good windows, a good facade, and a lot of mass, this is very good technique in many buildings. Go ahead to the next slide. So we want to spend a moment on this concept that energy efficiency means you're getting the most service out of every kilowatt hour. So we know what the lumens per watt is for efficient lighting, and we know what efficient chiller looks like, and we know what an efficient fan system. So we spent many decades as demand-side management people doing energy efficiency. And now we're moving to not just how much energy you use, but when you use it. So we want to time optimize the electric loads against the time of use charges or the peak demand charges, and we may actually change the service level. First of all, we want to optimize the service level for energy efficiency, and we want to temporarily change the service level for demand response. And the faster the demand response, the more value it has to the grid controllers, the grid operators, but you need different controls and different telemetry. So for a lot of the demand response research we've been doing and the field programs, they're using the hourly meters that the utilities have, but in many cases you need 4-second telemetry for the really fast demand response. And that can be very expensive to install the automation for very fast response, but many buildings and with variable frequency drives and pumping systems can provide very fast response as well. Now sometimes they'll make a change. The IKEA in Sacramento, we were working with them to test a reset strategy, and they said, wow, people are more comfortable. And then we said, well, okay, then do that every day, and we call that energy efficiency. So there's a very important relationship between retro commissioning and demand response, where we get the controls all working correctly and then try to go beyond normal operation for some small periods of time. And the more frequently you do that, the harder it might be. Go ahead to the next one. So just a little bit about the history of OpenADR. This is a NIST standard. We started the trials in 2002. We did a lot of work with PG&E and SoCal Edison. It's funded by the California Energy Commission. We handed the whole technology, the whole spec. It's basically a document that explained the XML code to the NIST Smart Standards process. It went through a standards development organization called OASIS, and then OpenADR 2.0 came out. Now, it's important to know some of the earlier work we did was on what was called 1.0. 2.0 actually has the OpenADR Alliance that provides formal certification and testing, so you can procure devices that comply with the OpenADR standard. The Chinese just published a standard in 2017 that's very similar to OpenADR. It's based on OpenADR. And the International Electrotechnical Committee created IEC 62746, which is now an international standard. So it can be adopted across the world, and it has both a U.S. and an international component, and all the control companies are members, Honeywell, Johnson, Siemens. So they're all aware of the standard, and there's over 130 devices available that comply with this. So a utility can procure automation and use signaling systems that comply with this open standard. Go ahead to the next slide. Well, actually, just to say, it's also required in Title 24 in California. So we are in the process of using it in new buildings here. This is a plot of the cost per kilowatt for installing the DR automation versus the number of kilowatts that you get from a demand response event. And you'll see here I have PG&E, a blue diamond, a red square for Bonneville Power, or a green triangle for PG&E in 07, and then the X's are NYSERDA. And you'll see there's different periods. Some of these are older PG&E data. Some of them are the 2012, 2013 PG&E data. And most of this is what we call the OpenADR 1.0, the triangles that are green that are so low. OpenADR was a lot cheaper because we had the installation process was a lot easier, but now it's gotten a little more expensive, and we're still training the contractors for for the 2.0 standard, and you'll see those are a couple $100 a kilowatt, up to $600 and $700 a kilowatt. So we're trying to understand how to bring the cost down to install the automation. We had one site that was less than $200 a kilowatt and over 800 kW available. So it's very important as we move from energy efficiency into these grid services that we understand how much is it costing to install this automation and to transact it in our grid services. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is a plot that I think is very important because all of the buildings here on this table had combined energy efficiency and demand response incentives. And most of those were related to controls. So there were a lot of energy management system upgrades that allowed the customer to have new controls as well as the OpenADR system. And you can see most of them did energy management systems and duty cycling. There's also one that had dimming of the lights and shutting off the plug loads in some of the hotels. The kW reduction is shown here, the total cost for the project in thousands of dollars, the incentive for the OpenADR technology, and the ratio of the DR technology to the total and the cost per kilowatt. So that was what I showed in that previous plot. And a lot of these technologies provide the facility manager with upgraded controls as well as the demand response automation capability. Go ahead to the next slide. Now, this slide lists 5 examples of research that we've done that went beyond hot summer day demand response. So we did a work with Bonneville Power on cold winter mornings in Seattle, and we've done fast DR projects. We did a non-spin reserve ancillary services in Northern California and some regulation research and a fast telemetry study in small commercial. And then we did some work with NYSERDA, trying to look at price signals and automation in New York using OpenADR. And the table on the bottom right shows the 4 buildings that we did in Seattle. Those buildings had both winter and summer demand response strategies built into the automation. So when they received an automation signal for a winter or a summer event, they had some of the technologies. For example, on Target, you see that they did the rooftop unit shut off. Now, what they do is they do every other rooftop unit. They don't shut them all off, but they'll randomly, actually, it's kind of every other. They'll cycle the zones through. And you see they can do that in winter or summer, and then the W or the S shows what season it's done in. So we could do the events in both seasons. Go ahead to the next slide. Now this shows a CAISO forecasted hourly bid and the actual customer response. So we're trying to see how fast we could get an electric load from a building to follow a signal from CAISO. And we were looking at the megawatts per minute, and you can see what the red line was, what we're trying to do, and what we actually did with the blue line. So in general, we were able to get the building loads to respond to the signals on a very fast time scale. And these architectures had that 4-second telemetry I was talking about, pushing the OpenADR signal with a little bit of a different architecture than we use for the slower projects. Go ahead to the next one. And similarly, this one shows on the left hand, it's a building load that had the green line is the reduction in the actual load. The red line is the signal that we were trying to follow, and then the blue is the baseline. So this one we were showing ramping services from a facility at UC Merced, the West Hill Farms, and San Mateo Community College, and we were able to provide a certain amount of megawatts per minute. And you can see on the right hand figure showing we actually turned on load at Merced to be able to take some wind in the middle of the night. So we were looking at what kind of loads could we actually automatically control and change the load shape with these automation signals. Go ahead to the next one. Now I'm going to quickly cover the demand response potential study from California. And here the idea was to generate a set of supply curves to estimate the cost of demand response in California and how many gigawatts was available from the customer loads in the state of California. And we used two ways that we decided where the market intersected with the supply curves. On the top, we used a price reference, which was about a couple $100 per kilowatt for a new turbine. And on the bottom, we actually used a model from E3 called Resolve to actually run a simplified production cost model and determine how much demand response was valued in the market at certain times to minimize the duck curve issues of the overgen and the ramp. That's my timer. I'm up time. Go ahead to the next slide. So we created 4 services called Shape, Shift, Shed, and Shimmy, and they all have different time scales. Shape is time of use response. Shift is the ability to use more at some part of the day and use less at other times of the day. Shed is the traditional hot summer DR, and Shimmy is like the modulate or the fast DR that can be energy neutral but a fast acting demand response. Go ahead to the next slide. So now I have pictures that show you a super off-peak rate. So California is actually experimenting with tariffs where the lowest cost is the middle of the day. And SoCal Edison is actually providing incentives for people to absorb some of that extra solar. And then that peak cost is around dinner time when that neck of the duck is happening. And we're trying to get people to, pre-cool their homes, charge their EVs, and shift load. Shimmy is that energy neutral, fast acting up and down. Go ahead to the next one. So shed is the traditional notch on a hot summer day, and then shift is using more in the middle of the day and less in those morning times. Go ahead to the next one. So this project involved collecting 200,000 electric load shapes from San Diego Gas and Electric, SoCal Edison, and PG&E, and we had 11 million demographic files. And so we actually recreated the customer load shape for the state of California, and we clustered the loads by type. So we had office buildings and retail and some various commercial. We had refrigerated warehouses. We had homes. We had industrial loads. And so we recreated 8760, and we forecasted out to 2025 with the state forecast. And then we ran something called demand response path that looked at measures to provide these grid services, the 4 ones that I said, and we estimated the cost to install technology and incentive payments to customers, and we created load shapes of what demand response is available in the market today at different price points, and how is that changing over the next 10 years with our forecast of customer load growth and technology changes. And then we use E3 for those curves that I mentioned about where the supply curve of demand response and the value curve from the market intersect. Go ahead to the next slide. So these are the technologies that we modeled. We're in the process of rerunning the shift model, but we did electric vehicles and behind-the-meter batteries that were automated. The 2 residential loads were residential air conditioning and pool pumps, HVAC systems, and lighting in refrigerated warehouses and commercial. We did large process industrial pumping, data centers, and wastewater treatment pumping. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is some of the main results. What we found was that you get about a gigawatt from time of use rates penetrating into the California market. So you get some demand response from the new tariffs. All California buildings will be on time of use prices where there's a high price from 5 to 9 over the next year. And that's going to provide us some change in the net load shape. For shed, we can be at about 2 to 10 gigawatts in California, but the most value is actually local. There's a lot of capacity in California, so at the system level, there's not a lot of value in the shed, but there's locational value, and that's one of the challenges is how to transact the locational value of those grid services. The most important thing we found was there's about $500 million a year in the shift concept. So we've been focusing in California on this new load shift concept and how do we pay for shift and what systems can provide shift. So that was about 2 to 5% of the daily load, and we're in the process of rerunning the model with new shift technologies. And then shimmy, we need only about 300 megawatts of it, but there's about $25 million a year of value from the shimmy regulation services in California. Go ahead to the next. So this is a quick look at some of the new projects we're doing with Monica. We're doing work on energy efficiency and demand response and how they're related. A lot of technologies, when you do the energy efficiency, like a lighting system retrofit, you also get the DR. So we're trying to understand the synergistic opportunities as well as where there might be some challenges. A thermal storage system may use more energy. So we were trying to understand how energy efficiency and demand response, DSM technologies interact and modeling them at the wholesale market. So that's a project that's underway. Service valuation, we have a project with Jared Langevin where we're trying to create tools for facility managers to understand the risk and the value of changing things in their facility and the way they might think about the valuation of those services. End-use load shape work, Natalie Frick from LBL is working with NREL, and they're working on both residential and commercial load shapes across the country. And then flexibility metrics, Peter Schwartz is leading a project where we're trying to develop a way for a facility manager to understand what flexibility is available from buildings and the metrics that can standardize our way of calculating and estimating the capability of different building types. So I won't go into all the details, but some of them are residential and commercial, some of them are hourly and seasonal, and we're going to go ahead to the next slide. This just one quick slide on our work with Lisa Schwartz and Steve Schiller. They are working on a report for you folks on looking at the state and local government opportunities for grid interactive efficient buildings. So this is a slide that sort of outlines some of what you'll be seeing there and assessing the value of demand flexibility and assessing the performance and the protocols and the data issues. And I think I have one more slide. So this is my final slide. I want to say that this is a really exciting time for the demand side management community as we think about the capability of buildings to provide these new services. There's a lot of research needed. So while we have case studies that show us that there are capabilities, there's a lot of research needed on modeling and understanding what's available today, understanding the field performance of these technologies, and the persistence of savings from an investment. So how long does the control system continue to work? And the need to make sure that the tariffs and the incentives are in place for a long enough time for there to be good investments. There's a lot of commissioning and controls and interoperability challenges, and the cost-benefit frameworks are emerging. But I want to emphasize that there are many cases where there's synergistic value between energy efficiency and demand response. And the facility managers are going to want to understand what the opportunities are in bringing those things together. So on the upper right hand, we have the complexity of controls, and we've had simple controls. Today, when you run your building, the electricity use is not part of the controls or the sequence. You pay the bill, you run the building. But in the future, you want energy-aware, grid-aware controls that are adaptive. So model predictive control is coming. And the picture on the right is showing you at the bottom that we're moving from a world of static energy efficiency to dynamic energy management. So we're having to think about new frameworks that consider the value of the health and the productivity and the connectivity and the EV charging. And so our infrastructure for building controls is really evolving, and there's a lot of great opportunities. And I'll stop right there.
Thank you, Marianne. That is tremendous. A lot going on, a lot to digest there in what you provided. I think we're going to be probably some of us will be coming back with you to you with more questions afterwards. I do want, speaking questions, I do want to remind people of the question box and get to a couple of them. One is a little bit of a different question. There was a query about, Monica had mentioned that ACEEE has a utility working group that's working essentially in parallel to our NASEO-NARUC state working group. And someone had asked about that. The good contact there is Rachel Gold, rgold@aceee.org. Or the person asking that question can contact me offline, and I'll provide that information. So one question that came up is, I guess, the question about advanced and smart meters. As you know, some states have very wide implementation of advanced metering infrastructure, where others not so much. Are advanced or smart meters prerequisite to doing some of this automated demand response and GEB activity, or there are other avenues for utility territories where such meters, the old-fashioned meters, are still present?
You want me to answer that? So certainly the traditional air conditioner cycling and even some of the water heating programs can pay a customer based on an average response rather than a measured response. So there are certainly some grid services that don't require smart meters, but most of them do.
Okay. Another question is, what sectors or building types seem more conducive or less conducive to early application of ADR and GEB, and why? I guess the question is, are the targets more likely to be, early targets more likely to be offices, retail, residential, and if residential, whether it's single family or multifamily? What seems to be more fruitful as earlier targets for state or utility wanting to implement some of this?
Absolutely, one of the best starting places is big box retail. Kohl's, Home Depot, Target, Walmart have been excellent partners, and they have centralized decision making. So, and they have more predictable electric loads. That's really one of the keys, is if you have a predictable electric load shape, you'll have predictable grid services. And if you have an irregular load shape, like a hotel or a mall, or a mall maybe is more predictable. So big box retail. Office buildings, yes, definitely government office buildings. So again, GSA, state buildings, getting the state involved, even county. We've done very well with many of our county partners. We have not tried to do this in hospitals or complex buildings. Schools are pretty good. And then as far as residential, the bring your own thermostat programs where you do have the smart meters have been very successful, because many of the DR communication that I mentioned, the utility can send a signal to a vendor's cloud. So Nest and Ecobee and Honeywell can get this automation through the cloud, and then from the cloud to the homeowner is proprietary. So those can provide both energy efficiency and demand response services, because these smart thermostats can often provide both. Multifamily is much harder because the metering is much more difficult. So a lot of this has been single family.
And Rod, if I could just add on to what Marianne said, I just note that we are actually doing some research to try to answer this question, to identify sort of the best sectors, and we should have some of that information in a few months that we can share. But I also would note that in residential, we actually think there's a huge opportunity because of sort of the time of the peak of energy use. But you also have, of course, to think about incentives. And right now, given some of the rates, there's less of an incentive for residential to maybe engage in some of this activity versus in commercial with demand charges. There's more of a financial incentive just based on the situation today.
Okay, thank you. So Monica, you actually touched upon another question, and so we're aware of peak charges usually apply to commercial and industrial customers, and some places have time of use rates, some don't, or some have time of use for commercial and industrial but not for residential. But beyond sort of the existing scheme of peak charges and time of use rates, are there other rate or market structures that are really needed to be in place to incite customers to participate?
Yeah, so there's been pretty good luck in California with the critical peak pricing or peak day pricing, and in other parts of the country, a two-part RTP that Georgia Power has, and even variable peak pricing. So there are some more dynamic tariffs. There's a subscription charge tariff that's kind of a transactive tariff that SoCal Edison is experimenting with 100 customers where they're on a subscription charge, and only beyond the baseline gets exposed to the spot market. So that's a little bit like Georgia Power's two-part real-time price. So there are a lot of innovations in tariffs. One of the good things about tariffs is there's no baseline needed when you use a tariff as a demand response trigger. You do need some kind of automation to get the signal to it can be day ahead or day of where the price changes, but the automation is going to help. So you can, what we call it, set and forget. And you could say, on a normal day, I want to run my house at 72, but when the price goes up, I want to let my house go up to 76. So you can kind of pre-program those things, and when the prices change, it automatically resets the temperature.
Okay, great. Another question is, I guess maybe I'll provide a little background of what I think is in the question. Signals can go to building energy management systems, or they can go directly to an end-use piece of equipment, or via demand response box, like Marianne, you had mentioned air conditioner switches, water heaters. So when and where might GEB and ADR operate through a building or facilities energy management system versus directly with the energy using equipment, whether it's an air conditioner, a water heater, or white goods, or whatever? And is there a need, for a facility that has a building energy management system but also grid interactive appliances? Is there some issue with coordinating between the individual equipment and the building system?
So the simple answer is that it is a challenge, and the majority of what we've seen in the field is communicating with for larger buildings, communicating with the traditional building automation energy management system, Honeywell, Johnson, Siemens kinds of systems with gateways. Those typically do not include the lighting, and sometimes for the lighting, many lighting companies come with OpenADR interfaces now, and so that is a challenge, is creating a centralized energy services interface that don't exist. It's a big challenge in homes. So we have, smart thermostats, and we may have a smart water heater, but they're not talking together yet. So we do need home energy management systems, and we need open APIs to better coordinate the loads. That's definitely an area of need.
And I would just add to that, at least from DOE, this is a great question, something we thought about a lot, and the way we've approached it from a research perspective is we're sort of keeping both options open, because I think, as you alluded to sort of with the earlier question, we're uncertain about what business models might evolve, et cetera. So it seems like the logical or maybe more organized approach would be some more of a central way, but we of course want to keep both options open, just ending to see how this market sort of evolves.
Okay, so it sounds like an area where there's a need for research, in part on the technical aspects of how to coordinate individual equipment with building management systems or automation systems, but also maybe something about the signals of the economic incentives as well, perhaps, or how one would subscribe to it. Mm-hmm. Sort of thinking aloud here. I think, let me look. There was a question to us about, is there still an opportunity to join the state working group? And the answer I'm going to give is a little ambiguous. So we've already accepted states into the group, but I would encourage those states which are not among the 13 that are listed to contact either Stephen or I or Danielle to have a discussion. Again, many of the activities of this group will be available to all the states, including the webinars in that, but we will be having more intense, more detailed exchange and work with the member states. So I guess the ambiguous answer is that there is some wiggle room, so let us know. Any other questions? So I think we are at the hour, or just, yeah, we're just at the hour. Good timing. So I think those are all the questions today. Again, the slides and the recording are going to be posted at the NASEO website, and we do encourage any inquiries about this topic. Please let us know. And thank you all very, very much. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you to all of you in the audience for your participation, and have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye-bye.